I came home from my father's funeral with a manila envelope in my hands and a number in my head that I still couldn't fully believe. $4.2 million, two commercial properties in Austin, and a private investment portfolio my father had been quietly building for 30 years. And when I pushed open the front door of my childhood home, I heard my mother-in-law laughing. Not a soft, sad laugh. Not the kind that slips out when you're grieving and don't know what else to do. A real laugh. The kind you hear at dinner parties when someone tells a good joke and the wine is flowing freely. I stood in the entryway with the envelope pressed against my chest, still wearing the black dress I'd chosen that morning while my husband was still asleep, and I did not move. The hardwood floor creaked once under my heel and I froze, my hand still on the brass doorknob. My husband's voice came first, low and deliberate, the way he talks when he's trying to sound reasonable. She won't fight it. She never fights anything, that's the whole point. My mother-in-law's voice again, I recognized it immediately, that honeyed drawl she puts on when she's feeling particularly pleased with herself. The estate attorney will transfer everything to a joint account within 60 days if she signs the disclaimer. Tell her it's a tax thing, she won't know the difference. And then my sister-in-law, who I had driven to the airport just 3 weeks ago because she couldn't afford the Uber, she's 29. She doesn't even know what a disclaimer of inheritance is. Just wave something official-looking in front of her and she'll sign it. My name is Elara. I am 29 years old. I had just buried my father that morning, and the 3 people I shared a home with were sitting in my father's living room, drinking his bourbon and planning how to steal what he left me. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without the full picture. My father raised me alone from the time I was 11, after my mother walked out on us for reasons she never fully explained, and we stopped trying to understand. It was just the 2 of us for almost 2 decades, him working double shifts at the architectural firm he eventually built into something remarkable, me doing homework at his drafting table and eating cereal for dinner more nights than I could count. We were not a wealthy family when I was growing up. We were a careful family. My father believed in working quietly and building slowly, and he did exactly that for 30 years without ever once telling me the full extent of what he'd accumulated. I found out the morning after he died when his attorney called and asked me to come to the office. I married my husband 3 years ago. His name is Crispin, and I want to be fair when I describe him, because for a long time I genuinely believed he was a good person who was simply under the influence of a very difficult family. His mother, Lorena, is the kind of woman who rearranges the furniture in other people's homes and then acts wounded when you move it back. His sister, Bethany, has never held a job for longer than 4 months and refers to this as being between chapters. I had tried for 3 years to be a good daughter-in-law and a patient sister-in-law, and what I had received in return was a steady, grinding erosion of my own confidence. By the time my father got sick, I had been reduced, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to a woman who apologized for taking up space in her own marriage. That is who they thought was standing outside the door that evening. They were wrong. What Lorena didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent the last 4 years working as a paralegal for one of the largest estate litigation firms in Austin. I had spent 4 years sitting across from families exactly like this one, watching people try to carve up inheritances that weren't theirs, and I knew every single legal mechanism they could try to use, and I knew every single counter to each one. I was not the woman they thought I was. I just hadn't had a reason to prove that yet. I stood in the entryway for another full minute, listening. I wanted every detail. The disclaimer of inheritance. That one was clever, actually, and I made a mental note to appreciate the research someone had done. If I signed a disclaimer, I would be legally treated as though I had predeceased my father, and the assets would pass to the next named beneficiary, which in the absence of other family would likely default to whatever arrangement they'd already set up. Crispin was the sole other person named in my father's general estate documents, placed there at my insistence 2 years ago when my father had a minor health scare, and I wanted everything in order. I had made it so easy for them. I took a slow breath. I did not walk into that living room. I walked to the small half bath near the entryway, closed the door silently, and sat down on the edge of the tub with the envelope in my lap. I opened it again. Even though I'd already read every page twice at the attorney's office, I needed to see the numbers in front of me while I planned. $4.2 million in liquid assets, held in a private trust. 2 commercial properties on the east side of Austin, both fully leased, both generating steady monthly income. A portfolio of index funds my father had been contributing to since 1994. And a handwritten letter, 3 pages long, in his careful architect's handwriting that I had not been able to read all the way through without crying. In the letter, my father wrote that he had set up the trust specifically so that the assets could not be transferred or disclaimed without the involvement of the trustee. His attorney, a woman named Ms. Vanden, who had handled his affairs for 15 years and who had already that afternoon quietly frozen every account pending my formal acceptance of the inheritance. My father had protected me before I even knew I needed protection. I sat in that bathroom and I let myself feel the grief for about 4 minutes. Real, raw, ugly grief. The kind where you put your hand over your mouth because you're afraid of the sounds that might come out. My father was gone. The man who had taught me to read blueprints and balance a checkbook and stand up straight in a room full of people who wanted you to make yourself smaller. He was gone, and I was sitting on the edge of his bathtub, listening to his bourbon being poured by the people who had spent 3 years making me feel invisible. Then I dried my face, put the envelope back together, and walked into the living room. They had arranged themselves with impressive naturalness, considering what I had just heard. Lorena was sitting in my father's wingback chair as though she'd been sitting there all her life, holding a glass of Pappy Van Winkle that she almost certainly didn't know the value of. Bethany was on the sofa with her legs tucked under her, scrolling her phone. Crispin was standing by the bookshelf, and when I came in he looked up at me with an expression of practiced concern that I recognized immediately as the look he puts on when he wants something. "There she is," Lorena said, and stood up to hug me. The hug lasted exactly long enough to look genuine. "How are you holding up, sweetheart? We were just talking about you." "I know," I said. She pulled back and looked at me. Something shifted in her expression, very small, very fast, and then it was gone, replaced with warm concern. "Come sit down. Can I get you something?" "I'm fine," I said. I sat down on the sofa across from Bethany, who tucked her phone away and gave me a sympathetic smile. "I actually want to talk to all of you about the estate." Crispin moved away from the bookshelf and sat beside me. He took my hand. His hand was warm and his grip was firm, and I thought about the 4 years I had spent trusting that hand, and I kept my face completely neutral. "Of course," he said. "Whenever you're ready. There's no rush." "Actually, I'd like to do it now," I said. Miss Vanden sent some preliminary documents home with me." I opened the envelope and pulled out the top sheet, a summary document, nothing binding, and laid it on the coffee table. "She mentioned there's a disclaimer option that could simplify things." I watched all 3 of their faces in the same moment. Lorena's eyes went to the document and she didn't quite succeed in hiding the flash of interest. Bethany sat up straighter. Crispin's grip on my hand tightened almost imperceptibly. "A disclaimer," Crispin said carefully. "What does that mean, exactly?" He knew what it meant. He had been researching it, but he needed me to be the one to raise it so that he could frame what came next as being for my benefit. "It means I could opt out of receiving the assets directly," I said. "Simplified tax treatment." Miss Vanden mentioned it as an option. "That sounds like it could make things much easier," Lorena said. Her voice was smooth and even, like she was commenting on the weather. "Inheritance can be so complicated. Tax implications, probate, all of it. If there's a simpler path." "There is," I said, "but I want to understand it fully before I sign anything." "Ms. Vanden wants to meet with all of us, together actually. She said it's standard procedure when a spouse is involved." Another flicker across his face. "Of course, whatever you need. She has some availability next week," I said. "I'll set it up." I changed the subject about her apartment. I asked Lorena how the drive had been. I poured myself a small glass of my father's bourbon, and I sat in his chair after Lorena vacated it, and I felt him with me in the room, steady and quiet the way he always was, and I held myself together until they went to bed. Then I called Ms. Vanden. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had been expecting to hear from me. I heard them, I said. She was quiet for a moment. How much? Enough. The disclaimer, the joint account, all of it, Elara. Her voice was careful. I want you to know that the trust structure your father put in place makes it virtually impossible for anyone to redirect those assets without your active and fully informed consent. Even if you signed a disclaimer tonight, which I am advising you not to do, the trustee provisions override the standard intestate flow. The assets would go into a protected holding, not to a named secondary beneficiary. I know, I said. I read the documents 3 times this afternoon. Then you understand that they can't actually take anything from you. They don't know that, I said. And I want to understand exactly how far they're willing to go before I show them that. Another pause. Then, what do you need from me? I told her. The meeting Ms. Vanden agreed to hold the following week was on the surface a routine estate orientation. She sent a formal letter to the address. My father's house, where we were all staying through the week, with the time and location and a request that Crispin bring 2 forms of identification. Standard procedure, the letter said. For spousal acknowledgement. What the letter didn't mention was that Ms. Vanden had spent the previous day pulling Crispin's financial records, which I had given her written authorization to access, and what she found was not a surprise to me, but was a very thorough confirmation of things I had been quietly noticing for 2 years. Crispin had 3 credit cards I didn't know about. He had a personal account at a bank in his mother's name, funded by transfers from our joint account over the past 18 months. Small amounts, irregular intervals, exactly the pattern you'd use if you were trying to avoid triggering reporting thresholds. He had a business registration in Delaware for a consulting company that had no clients and no revenue, but did have, as of 4 months ago, a very favorable loan guarantee based on projected future income from an inheritance he had no legal claim to yet. He had taken out a loan against money I hadn't even known I was inheriting yet. The meeting was set for Thursday at 2. On Tuesday, Bethany asked me very casually if I'd figured out the inheritance paperwork, and I told her I was still processing everything emotionally and that it was hard to think about financial details right then. She patted my hand and told me to take my time and that they were all there to support me. On Wednesday morning, Crispin brought me coffee in bed and sat on the edge of the mattress and told me he loved me and that we were going to get through this together. And I looked at him and nodded and said I knew, and I thought about the loan guarantee in Delaware, and I did not cry. I was done crying. I had given myself those 4 minutes in the bathroom, and that was enough. Thursday afternoon, we drove to Ms. Vanden's office together. Lorena and Bethany came too. Ms. Vanden had extended the invitation, citing the importance of a seek transparency in estate matters, and Lorena accepted so fast she was already dressed when I came downstairs. The office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a long conference table that Ms. Vanden clearly used for exactly this kind of meeting. She was in her 60s, with silver hair and the particular calm of someone who had watched a lot of people try to do a lot of things in a lot of conference rooms and was rarely surprised by any of it. She welcomed everyone, offered water, and opened the meeting by distributing folders. Lorena picked hers up immediately. I watched her eyes move across the first page. Whatever she was expecting, it wasn't what she was looking at, because she flipped to the second page, then back to the first, and a small line appeared between her brows. "This is the trust document," Ms. Vanden said pleasantly. "The full version which I want to walk through in detail today. Elara has already reviewed it, but I find it's helpful for everyone to hear it explained in the same room at the same time. Avoids misunderstandings." She began at the beginning. She was thorough and unhurried, and she did not skip the trustee provisions, and she did not soften the language around asset protection, and she did not gloss over the section that explained, in precise legal terms, what a disclaimer of inheritance actually does and does not do in the state of Texas in the context of a revocable trust with an active trustee. I watched Crispin's face while she talked. It was a study in controlled reaction. The slight tightening around his eyes when she explained that a disclaimer would not redirect assets to a spousal secondary beneficiary, the barely perceptible shift in his posture when she outlined the trustee's authority to freeze and hold pending any credible evidence of undue influence or coercion. The moment I saw it precisely when he understood that the loan he had guaranteed in Delaware was secured against money he was never going to see. Lorena stopped pretending to follow along around page 6. She set her folder on the table and looked at me directly for the first time since we'd sat down. "This is a lot of legal language," she said. "The bottom line, what does Elara actually need to do to access these assets?" "Accept the inheritance formally," Ms. Vanden said. "Sign the acceptance document, which Elara will do today. After that, the trust transfers to her sole management. It's quite straightforward." "And the disclaimer option," Lorena said. "You mentioned the disclaimer option is not applicable in this case," Ms. Vanden said, with the pleasantness of someone who has delivered bad news so many times it has lost all its drama. "The trust structure precludes it. I'm sorry if that was unclear in my preliminary communication." Bethany looked at Crispin. Crispin looked at his folder. Ms. Vanden produced the acceptance document and slid it across the table to me. I picked up the pen she offered. "Before I sign," I said, "I'd like to share something with everyone." I reached into my bag and placed a folder on the table. It was thin, only a few pages, but Ms. Vanden had helped me put it together, and the pages it contained were specific and well-sourced. "The account statements from the joint account," I said, "covering the last 18 months, and the Delaware business registration, and the loan guarantee document which I was able to obtain because the lender's compliance office is required to disclose it upon request when the underlying asset is currently in dispute." The silence in the room had a particular quality to it, not the silence of shock, though Bethany's expression was definitely in that territory, but the silence of people rapidly recalculating. "Crispin," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, "you guaranteed a business loan using an inheritance you had no legal right to. You moved money from our joint account to your mother's bank over the course of a year and a half. And you sat next to me on the sofa 3 nights ago and told me you loved me while you were planning to redirect everything my father worked for." He opened his mouth. I had been waiting for years, I realized, to see what he would say when there was nothing useful left to say. What he said was, "Elara, I can explain." "You don't need to," I said. "Ms. Vanden has already been in contact with the lender's fraud department, the Zozrenku, the loan, and I filed for divorce this morning." Lorena's hand came down on the table, flat, like a punctuation mark. "You cannot be serious. After everything this family has done for you." "I want to be very clear about something," I said, turning to look at her directly. "I am the sole beneficiary of a fully protected trust. My husband does not have legal access to those assets and never did. The loan he guaranteed in Delaware will be recalled by the lender, and the liability for that will be entirely his. The money he moved from our joint account over the last 18 months will be addressed in the divorce proceedings which are already underway." I paused. "There is nothing here for you. There was never anything here for you. I just wanted you to understand that before we all went home." Bethany made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a gasp. Lorena had gone very still. Crispin was looking at me the way people look at something they thought they understood and are now realizing they never understood at all. I signed the acceptance document. Ms. Vanden witnessed it. The meeting was over in 7 minutes after that. In the elevator on the way down, the 4 of us stood in a silence so total I could hear the mechanical hum of the cables. When the doors opened in the lobby, Lorena and Bethany walked out ahead of us. Lorena did not look back. Bethany glanced over her shoulder once, and whatever she saw in my face made her turn away quickly. Crispin and I stood alone in the elevator for just a moment after the doors started to close again. He put his hand on the door to stop it. "I didn't think it would go this far," he said, which was not an apology, and we both knew it. "I know," I said. "That's the problem." I stepped out of the elevator and did not look back. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. The loan in Delaware was recalled within 30 days of the lender's fraud review, and Crispin was responsible for the full balance. He contested the divorce settlement once, briefly, with a lawyer who I suspect he could not actually afford, and the contest was resolved in 2 weeks when Ms. Vanden's office submitted the account transfer records to the mediator. Lorena called me twice in the first month after the meeting. I let it go to voicemail both times. The messages were long and involved words like ungrateful and after everything and I deleted them without finishing either one. I changed my number after the second call. Bethany sent me a text 8 weeks later that said simply, "I'm sorry," and I did not respond because I wasn't sure she was, and I had learned that year that my peace was worth more than the uncomfortable kindness of accepting an apology I couldn't verify. My father's letter, the 3-page handwritten one, I finally read all the way through on a Tuesday evening in October, sitting at the kitchen table of the apartment I'd rented on the west side of Austin, with a cup of tea and no one else around. He wrote that he had always seen me more clearly than I saw myself. He wrote that he trusted me to protect what he built, because I had been watching him build it since I was 11 years old, and I understood, better than anyone, what it had cost him. He wrote that the money wasn't the point. He wrote that the point was that I should never let someone else decide what I was worth. I read it 3 times and then I folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and set it on the kitchen counter where I could see it. I took over management of the 2 Austin properties the following spring. I left the paralegal position not because I had to, but because I had spent 4 years watching other people fight for what belonged to them, and I decided I was done watching and ready to build something of my own. I enrolled in law school in the fall. I paid the first tuition deposit from the trust account, and I sat with that for a moment, the weight of it, what it meant that he had made it possible without ever knowing exactly how I would use it. The grief comes in waves still. It will, I think, for a long time. But there is something underneath the grief now, something solid and mine and built on a foundation that no one can disclaim or redirect or quietly reroute to a Delaware LLC while I'm sleeping. My father raised me to stand up straight in a room full of people who wanted me to make myself smaller. It took me 29 years and a manila envelope and 4 minutes crying on the edge of a bathtub to understand what that actually meant. I understand it now.